That morning, the town no longer existed. Clara Jasper stood at the mouth of the stone house, one hand pressed against the frost-rimmed doorframe, and looked down at what the night had made of Cold Creek. There was no smoke rising from any chimney. There were no rooftops breaking the white plain below, no lantern light in any window, no sound of a dog barking or a wagon wheel groaning over frozen ruts. There was only snow, vast and unbroken, gleaming faintly blue in the last hour before dawn, stretching from the base of the mountain to the place where the church steeple had once stood. She did not move for a long time. Behind her, deep in the mountain's belly, she could hear the low murmur of frightened voices, the cough of a child, the creak of rope against iron. 51 people were sheltering in the rock at her back. Somewhere beneath the white silence in front of her, perhaps 300 more were buried alive or dead, or dying in houses that had not been built to hold, against 11 days of the worst blizzard the territory had ever recorded. 3 years ago, they had laughed at her for choosing stone. Clara Jasper had been born in a quarry town in Pennsylvania in a house her father had cut from the hillside with his own hands, and she had learned to read rock before she had learned to read words. Elias Cobb was a master stonemason. A broad, quiet man with limestone dust worked so deep into the creases of his palms that no amount of scrubbing ever brought them fully clean. And he had raised his only daughter the way another man might have raised a son he intended for the trade. By the age of 7, she could tell a sound stone from a fractured one by the ring it gave under a hammer. By 12, she understood the difference between a wall that merely stood and a wall that endured, how a foundation needed to breathe with the frost instead of fighting it, how a roof needed weight distributed like a held breath, how a building done properly was less a thing that was built than a thing that was persuaded to agree with the mountain it stood upon. She had gone on against considerable resistance from men who did not believe a woman belonged on a scaffold to help design 2 river bridges and a military fortification in the Dakota Territory, work for which she was paid honestly and credited rarely. It was on that fortification project, in the second bitter winter of her career, that she met Professor Samuel Jasper, a mild, sharp-eyed historian who had come west to document frontier architecture for a university survey, and who had, by his own later admission, fallen in love with her before he ever learned her first name, simply from watching her argue a kernel out of a design flaw in a retaining wall. Samuel was not a man who required his wife to be smaller than she was. This, more than any romance, was what Clara loved in him. He listened when she spoke of load-bearing angles, the way other husbands listened to talk of weather with genuine and unhurried interest. And in turn, she came slowly to care as much as he did for the old records. He kept town charters, weather journals, the half-forgotten accounts of earlier settlements that had failed, and the reasons plainly written, if anyone troubled to read them, why they had failed. It was one such journal that first led them to the territory that would become their home. They arrived in Cold Creek in the spring of 1879, drawn by a letter from a mining company advertising land at a generous price to any family willing to settle near the new silver works being sunk into the eastern ridge. The town itself was young and raw, perhaps 4 years old, built in the enthusiastic temporary manner of places that expect to become rich quickly and see no reason to build for a future they assume will provide for itself. Pine framing went up fast and cheap. Roofs were shingled thin. Chimneys were mortared in haste. The main street was a churn of mud in spring and a sheet of ice in winter, lined with clapboard storefronts that shuddered visibly when the wind came down off the peaks, and at the head of that street stood the largest and least sensible building in the territory, the half-finished mansion of Mr. Augustus Pruitt, president of the Cold Creek Mining and Trust Company, a 3-story confection of gables and gingerbread trim being raised, board by imported board, to announce to the wilderness that a man of consequence had arrived in it. Clara took one look at the town, at its thin walls and its low, hurried roofs, at the way every structure in it seemed to face the wrong direction, catching the worst of the northern wind instead of turning a shoulder against it, and she did not build in it at all. Instead, 3 weeks after their arrival, she rode out along the base of the eastern bluff, a great gray shoulder of granite that rose above the town like something that had always intended to outlast it, and she found a place where an old rockfall had left a natural hollow in the stone, sheltered on 3 sides facing due south into the sun. She stood in that hollow for the better part of an afternoon, Samuel patiently holding the horses while she read the mountain, the way her father had taught her, the grain of the rock, the runoff channels worn by 100 years of snowmelt, the angle of the light at midday. When she finally turned back to him, there was a look on her face he had learned by then to trust completely. "Here," she said, "we build here, into it, not against it." The bank would not extend credit for the purchase of a rock face. No one in Cold Creek could quite understand why anyone would want one. Mr. Pruitt himself, meeting Clara in the Mercantile a week later, offered, not unkindly though, with the particular condescension of a man who believes he is being generous to a woman's whim, to buy the parcel back from her at a modest profit on the grounds that she and her husband would surely wish come winter to move into town proper like sensible people. Clara thanked him for his concern and declined. The exchange was repeated with minor variations at the feed store, at the church social, at the schoolhouse fundraiser, until it settled into a kind of running joke that followed her quietly through the town's daily business, the stonemason's daughter and her cave. She did not argue with any of it. She had learned long ago that explaining a foundation to people who had never watched one fail was a waste of breath, better spent laying stone. In June, she began. She worked first with hand drills and black powder, opening a modest gallery into the rock face 12 feet deep, 10 feet wide, just enough for a single room and a hearth. And Samuel, who had never held a chisel in his life before that spring, learned to haul stone and clear rubble, and eventually, under her patient instruction, to cut a true joint. In the evenings, he wrote in his journal by lamplight, and more than once Clara found him composing not notes on frontier architecture, but simple, plain accounts of his wife at work. The set of her jaw when she was reading a fault line, the particular silence that came over her when a cut went cleanly as though the mountain had for a moment agreed with her. By the time the first hard frost came that October, they had one finished room, a hearth that drew true, and a door of oak and iron set deep into granite, and Clara stood in the opening of it at dusk, looking out over the whole silvered valley and the small huddled lights of the town below, and felt something settle in her chest that she did not yet have a name for, though she would come in the years that followed to understand it as the particular satisfaction of a woman who has finally been permitted to build the things she always knew how to build. Behind her in the dark of the new room, Samuel struck a match to the kindling she had laid, and the first fire in the house on the mountain caught and held and did not gutter even when the wind rose outside to test it. They would later calculate, exactly 6 years before the mountain would be asked to keep the promise they were building into it that autumn. Neither of them knew this yet. What Clara knew, standing in her doorway with the Mercantile's laughter still faintly ringing behind her from that afternoon, was simpler and older than any calculation that a wall built to please its neighbors and a wall built to survive its winter were never in the end the same wall, and that sooner or later every mountain town in the territory would be made to learn which kind it had chosen. She picked up her chisel, set it against the next stone, and began again. The 2 years that followed were not a season of drama, but of accumulation, and Clara had learned from her father that accumulation was the truer test of a builder's character than any single dramatic act. A wall was not raised in a day of inspiration. It was raised in 10,000 small correct decisions, each one boring in isolation, each one indispensable together. She and Samuel widened the gallery through that first winter, cutting a second chamber behind the first, then a third below it connected by a stair notched directly into the living rock. She oriented every window to the south, angling the deep-set sills so that the low winter sun would reach to the back wall of each room, while the high summer sun would barely cross the threshold, a trick her father had shown her once in a chapel in the old country, though he had never had occasion to build it himself. She cut ventilation channels that rose at a slant through 8 feet of granite, drawing smoke up and away from the hearths without ever admitting a draft. And she tested each one for a full week before trusting it, burning green pine to see how the smoke behaved, adjusting the angle a half-inch at a time until it drew clean in every wind she could contrive to test it against. Behind the main chambers, she opened a fourth room cooler than the rest half again, as deep and lined its walls with dry-fitted stone shelving. For the root cellar potatoes, onions, dried apples, salted meat jars of preserve that Clara put up herself each autumn, with the same unhurried thoroughness she brought to a joint of stone. Below that, following a seam of softer rocks, she and Samuel dug a well shaft down to a spring that never froze even in the coldest months, so that water could be drawn from inside the mountain without a single trip into open weather. And along the northern flank of the hollow, where the rock face gave way to a shallow ravine, she carved a stable, narrow, low-ceilinged, warmed by its nearness to the kitchen hearth, on the other side of 18 inches of stone for the 2 horses and the milk cow that Samuel, not without some pride, had begun to call the finest housed livestock in the territory. While the Jaspers worked in patient silence on the bluff, the town below worked in a different key entirely. Augustus Pruitt's mansion rose through that same year in a great deal more noise. Imported glass hauled up from the railhead at considerable expense. A mansard roof of a style more suited to a coastal city than a mountain valley. A wide veranda that faced not south into the sun, but east toward the road, so that every visitor arriving in Cold Creek would see it first and understand at once whose town this truly was. Pruitt was not a cruel man, only a proud one, and his pride was of a common and forgivable sort. He wanted more than almost anything to be seen to have arrived, and a house was the plainest language in which a man could say so. The two philosophies of building sat less than 2 miles apart that year, and almost no one in Cold Creek thought to compare them because almost no one thought of Clara's stonehouse as a serious building at all. It was in the town's settled opinion an eccentricity, charming in the way that a hermit's cabin might be charming, worth a curious glance and nothing more. There were that second autumn signs that a harder winter than usual was coming, if anyone had troubled to read them. The deer came down off the high slopes nearly a month early, moving through the valley in numbers. Old Ezra Tillman, who had trapped in these mountains for 30 years, said he had not seen since before the town existed. The geese that usually passed high overhead in loose, unhurried lines flew instead in a tight, urgent formation, low and fast, gone south within a single week, where they usually took a month to pass. Ezra himself said as much at the Mercantile one evening, leaning on the counter with the particular flat certainty of a man who has learned to trust weather over calendars, and was met with the same good-natured indulgence. The town reserved for Clara a nod, a chuckle, a change of subject. Clara did not chuckle. She had grown up in a family that treated an old trapper's word on weather with the same seriousness. Her father gave a hairline crack and a keystone, and that autumn, without announcement, without argument, she began to prepare for a winter no one else in Cold Creek believed was coming. She and Samuel laid in twice the usual store of grain and salted meat packed into the cool of the root cellar until the shelves groaned under it. She coiled and recoiled every length of rope she owned, testing each for fray, and bought more from the Mercantile until the clerk asked half in jest whether she meant to hang the whole town. She had Samuel forge, with the smith's grudging help, a dozen iron anchor pins driven deep into the rock at intervals along the approach to the house, so that a rope line could be run from the door all the way down to the valley floor in weather too blind to navigate by sight. She stockpiled lamp oil, candles, dry kindling, split fine, and stacked in a room of its own, and at Samuel's quiet suggestion, made one evening as he watched her work by firelight, she began almost as an afterthought to widen the lower chambers further than either of them yet had reason to need. "You are building rooms we don't use," he said once, not as a complaint but as an observation. "Not yet," Clara answered, and did not explain further because she did not yet fully know herself what she was building toward, only that the mountain had never once in her long study of it given her a false signal, and that some old instinct inherited from her father's hands told her to trust the room before she trusted the reason. By November, the sky over Cold Creek had taken on a color Clara had seen only twice before in her life. Both times before storms her father had called generational, a low bruised gray that pressed close to the peaks and refused for days at a stretch to lift. The wind that had always come down the eastern ridge in the evenings began instead to blow all through the day, steady and cold, carrying with it a smell Ezra Tillman named, when Clara asked him plainly one afternoon at the edge of town, as the smell of snow that had not yet decided how much of itself it intended to give. That night, standing once more in the doorway of the house, she and Samuel had spent 2 years building into the mountain's shoulder. Clara watched the clouds finish gathering over Cold Creek and felt for the first time since she had set her chisel to the first stone something colder than the wind moving through her. She went inside and began to check once more every rope, every anchor, every door. It began on the 4th of December in the gray hour before full light, with a wind that did not build gradually, but arrived all at once as though a door somewhere far to the north had been thrown open. By mid-morning, the snow had come with it, not falling so much as traveling sideways, and by noon, Cold Creek had vanished behind it entirely. The church steeple, the Mercantile's painted sign, the gabled roofline of Augustus Pruitt's mansion, all swallowed into a single moving wall of white. Clara had known by the particular flat pressure in the air that morning that this was the storm the deer and the geese and old Ezra Tillman had been trying to tell the valley about for a month. She and Samuel spent the last clear hour before the wind rose running the rope line from the house door down to the first anchor pin, then the second, checking every fitting with hands that had grown steady from 2 years of practice. And they were inside the great oak and iron door, sealed and barred the fire built up in the main hearth, before the first true gust reached the bluff. What followed they would later understand was 11 days that the survivors of Cold Creek would speak of for the rest of their lives only in fragments, because no one who lived through the whole of it hour by hour ever found it easy to hold the entire memory in their mind at once. In the town below, the storm did what the thin walls and hurried roofs had never been built to withstand. Snow accumulated not in a gentle blanket, but in drifts that climbed the sides of buildings faster than any resident had thought possible, pressing against clapboard walls with a weight the framing had never been designed to bear, burying whole structures to the eaves within the first 2 days and to the roof lines within 4. Chimneys choked by drift and driven snow threw smoke back down into homes faster than families could clear them, and more than one household spent that second night huddled close to the floor, coughing, breaking what windows they could reach to let the smoke escape into a world that had become outside a solid and murderous white. On the bluff, the house that had been laughed at for 2 years did almost nothing at all. The ventilation channels Clara had cut and tested through her first winter drew smoke up and away exactly as she had built them to. The southern windows, deep set and narrow, held against a wind that found no purchase on their angled sills. The great mass of stone around them, 8, 10, 12 feet of solid granite in places, did what stone had always done since long before any human hand had shaped it. It held its temperature indifferent to the fury outside, warming only by the slow, patient work of the hearths within. Clara and Samuel moved through those first days in a rhythm they had, without quite realizing. It'd been rehearsing for 2 years, banking the fires at night, checking the well shaft, portioning the stores, listening to a wind that howled against rock it could not move. On the 6th day, in a lull between gusts, Clara heard something that was not wind. It came from the direction of the town, carried up faintly through air, gone strange with cold and pressure. A long groaning crack, followed by a silence that felt, even at that distance, like the aftermath of something enormous giving way. She stood at the narrow gap of the storm door for a long time afterward, unable to see anything through the white, and did not need to see to understand with the same certainty she had once used to read a fault line in granite, that a roof somewhere below had failed under its load. She learned 2 days later that it had been the mansion. Augustus Pruitt's grand veranda, built to face the road, instead of the weather, had given the storm's full force nothing to deflect it, and the wide imported glass windows that had once announced his arrival to the valley had one by one surrendered to the pressure of drift piling against them, unbroken for 6 days. On the 8th day, with the upper floor already buckling under snow that had found its way in through a failed window and frozen solid across the ballroom floor, the mansion's overextended roof, a design chosen for silhouette rather than load, spanning a width. No timber in the territory was truly suited to came down whole in the night, folding the top 2 stories into the first with a sound that carried all the way to the bluff. Clara heard it happen. She could do nothing. There was no path through that white to reach any part of the town, no rope line strung between the mountain and the valley floor. No way to know in that moment whether Augustus Pruitt and his family were alive beneath what remained of the house he had built to be seen. She sat that night by the hearth with her hands pressed flat against her knees, and Samuel, watching her, understood that this, not the 2 years of laughter, not the bank's refusal, not the mercantile's running joke, was the true cost of having been right. To have built correctly while a town built wrong, and to be able to do nothing in the moment it mattered most but wait. The storm did not begin to weaken until the 10th day, and even then it surrendered its grip slowly, grudgingly, the wind dropping by degrees rather than all at once, as though reluctant to admit it had spent itself. By the 11th night, the sky had cleared enough in patches to show stars for the first time in over a week, and Clara stood again at her door, as she had stood at the very beginning of this account, though she did not yet know it was the beginning of anything, and looked down at a valley gone utterly silent and utterly white, with no way yet to know how many of the people beneath that silence were still breathing. She spent that last night before dawn, coiling rope-checking anchor pins, filling every pack she owned with what the cellar could spare, while Samuel banked the fire low and readied the 2 horses in the stable that had never once in 11 days grown cold. At first light, they went down into the snow together. The descent from the bluff took most of the morning, not because the distance was great, but because the drifts had reshaped the mountain's approach, entirely burying the old trail under snow in places 12 feet deep. And Clara and Samuel moved with the slow, deliberate caution of people who understood that a broken leg now would cost lives they had not yet had the chance to save. They used the rope line where it still held, cut new anchors where it did not, and reached the edge of what had once been Cold Creek's main street a little after 10 in the morning, to find a town reduced to a landscape of white mounds, broken only here and there by the black stub of a chimney or the corner of a roof pressed nearly flush with the snow. They did not know, standing at that edge, where to begin. Clara chose the nearest mound first because the alternative was standing still. And standing still had never once solved anything a mountain had taught her to build against. The first house belonged to the Hollisters, a family of 5, whose roofline Clara located by the angle of a chimney pipe barely breaking the surface. She and Samuel dug by hand and shoveled through nearly 4 feet of packed snow to reach the door, working in a rhythm that would repeat itself with variations dozens of times over the following days. Clear, test, listen, call out. Wait for an answer that did not always come. When the Hollisters' door finally gave, the family was found huddled together around a dead stove, in air gone thin and smoke-stained alive, but only barely the youngest child unconscious from the cold, and revived only after Clara wrapped her in her own coat and carried her the full distance back up to the mountain house herself, refusing to hand the girl to anyone else along the way. Each house that followed was its own small, complete story, and Clara came to understand over the following days why the work could not be rushed, even though every instinct screamed to move faster. Dr. Ansel Fry, the town's physician, was found alive in the ruin of his surgery, having kept himself and 2 patients warm by burning his own furniture book by book and chair by chair through the worst of the storm, and once freed, he became indispensable, moving from house to house alongside Clara and Samuel, treating frostbite and smoke sickness with an exhausted, methodical calm that matched Clara's own. An elderly widow named Mrs. Halloran was dug free from beneath her own collapsed roof, having survived 11 days in a space no larger than a coffin, by breathing through a gap she had scraped clear with a fire iron. And when the opening finally widened enough to see daylight, she did not weep or cry out, only asked in a voice gone hoarse from disuse whether her cat had survived. It had. 2 young brothers, Thomas and Peter Nash, were found beneath the wreckage of the schoolhouse, where they had taken shelter from the storm's first hour, having kept each other alive by taking turns sleeping, so that one was always awake to keep the other from succumbing to the cold. The greatest test came on the 4th day of digging, when Clara and Samuel, with Dr. Fry and a growing party of townsfolk strong enough now to help in the effort, reached what remained of the Pruitt mansion. The collapse had folded the upper floors down into the first, with a violence that made the earlier smaller houses look almost gentle by comparison, and for a long while, as they cleared beam after broken beam, no one spoke of what they expected to find. It was Clara herself who finally heard it, a faint, irregular tapping from somewhere beneath a fallen section of the grand staircase, too rhythmic to be the settling of debris. They worked the rest of that day and into the night to clear a path down to it, and when the opening was finally wide enough, it was Augustus Pruitt who emerged first, gaunt and hollow-eyed, with his 2 children wrapped inside his own coat, having kept them alive through 11 days by feeding them the last of his pantry stores by hand and sacrificing his own share almost entirely. He looked up in the lantern light and found Clara Jasper kneeling at the edge of the opening, offering her hand down into the dark. He did not say anything at first. There was perhaps nothing a man in his position could have said that would not have sounded smaller than the moment demanded, not to the woman whose stone house he had once offered kindly and condescendingly to buy back from her, not to the builder whose mountain had held while his veranda had not. He simply took her hand and let her pull him the rest of the way into the light, and the look that passed between them in that instant, not triumph on her part, not humiliation on his, but something quieter and more durable than either would be spoken of in Cold Creek for years afterward, as the moment the town's opinion of Clara Jasper changed for good. By the end of the first week of digging the house on the bluff, sheltered more than 50 survivors crowded into chambers that had been built without anyone quite planning it that way for exactly this. The root cellar that Clara had stocked double against a winter no one believed in was by the second week showing its bottom shelves, and she began with the same clear-eyed practicality she brought to every problem Stone had ever handed her to ration what remained, and send Samuel with a small party down to the buried mercantile to recover what stores could still be salvaged from beneath the snow. It was not triumph those 2 weeks, it was work hour after hour of it, and grief for those who could not be reached in time, and the particular hard-won relief of watching a town that had mocked her for 2 straight years come one dugout doorway at a time to understand exactly what she had built and why. By the time the last of the snow began its slow spring retreat from the valley floor, Cold Creek was no longer the town it had been the previous autumn, and not only because of what the storm had destroyed. The meeting that decided its future was held fittingly inside the mountain, in the largest of Clara's chambers, the one she had once called a room they did not yet use, now packed shoulder to shoulder with nearly every survivor. The 11 days had left them. Augustus Pruitt, thinner than he had been his grand mansion, now nothing but a foundation, and a story stood near the back, rather than at the front. A small change in a man that told the room a great deal about the winter he had survived. The question on everyone's mind was simple, and no one wanted to be the first to ask it aloud, so Ezra Tillman finally did. What now did they rebuild Cold Creek, as it had stood board for board in the same low valley where the wind had found it so easily? It was Clara who answered, and she did not answer as a woman claiming vindication, though she would have been forgiven for it. She answered as a builder, plainly the way her father had once explained a fault line to her as a child, not with triumph, but with patience, because the truth of a thing did not require decoration to be worth hearing. Do not rebuild the old town, she told them. Build into the mountain instead. There was hesitation at first, as there always is, when a settled way of living is asked to change, but it did not last as long as it once might have. The town had spent 11 days learning in the plainest possible terms which kind of wall endured a winter, and which kind did not, and there is no more persuasive teacher than a lesson survived firsthand. Within the month, the first of Cold Creek's young men and women came to Clara, asking to learn the trade she had practiced alone on the bluff for 3 long years. How to read a fault line, how to cut a true joint, how to orient a window toward a sun that would still be shining long after any of them were gone. She taught them without impatience, the way she wished all those years ago that someone besides her father had been willing to teach her. Through that spring and summer, the sound of chisel on stone became as common along the eastern bluff as the sound of a saw once had been on the valley floor. New chambers opened into the rock. New wells sunk to springs that never froze. New south-facing windows cut at the careful angle Clara had spent 2 winters perfecting entirely alone. Augustus Pruitt, who might once have funded another grand veranda instead, put the last of his fortune into a very different kind of building. A great stone community hall cut deep into the bluff beside Clara's own house, wide enough to hold the whole town at once. Warmed by a hearth Clara herself helped design and lit for the first time on the first anniversary of the storm. Samuel, through all of it, kept doing what he had always done, writing. He gathered 2 years of preparation and 11 days of survival, and the long spring of rebuilding that followed into a single careful manuscript, illustrated with his own measured drawings of ventilation channels and southern sills and root cellar shelving, entitled it simply after the woman whose work it documented, the Jasper method. Copies of it found their way over the following years to towns across the territory that had weathered their own hard winters less well than Cold Creek had, and more than one grateful letter arrived at the stone house on the bluff, from families who had built their first true foundation from nothing more than Samuel's careful pages and Clara's patient philosophy distilled into instructions any determined hand could follow. Years passed as years do, gently smoothing the sharpest edges of memory, the way a river smooths stone, though never quite erasing what had been carved there. Cold Creek grew into the mountain around Clara's original chambers until the two were no longer easily told apart, a town built the way she had always believed a town ought to be built, into its landscape rather than against it. One clear autumn morning, many years after the storm, a small group of travelers arrived at the base of the eastern bluff, having come a considerable distance from a territory 2 states over, drawn by a worn copy of Samuel's manuscript and a hope that its author's methods might still be taught firsthand. They found Clara exactly where they might have expected to find her, chisel in hand, gray now at the temples, but steady in the wrist, working a new joint into a new stone, with the same unhurried care she had brought to the very first one decades before. A young man near the front of the group, hat in his hands, asked the question that had brought them all this distance. "Mrs. Jasper," he said, "where do we begin?" Clara set down her chisel, looked past him for a moment to the mountain that had kept its promise to her for longer than most promises are kept, and smiled the way a person smiles when a question has, in truth, only ever had one honest answer. "Listen to the mountain first," she said, and she picked up her chisel again and began.